Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, yes, they did. They absolutely got it right. This is your host, Tom Navolis, and boy, I appreciate that as we close out this year, 2018, that it's just been a fabulous year. And I've been primarily on Liberty Works Radio Network. They have been awesome to me over these last number of years. So delighted to be on Saturday's programming, both at 9 a.m. at 7 p.m. What an honor. A great, great, great network. Just hope that you are looking at it, you're participating with it and in it, and enjoying all the programming that's there during the week. Yes, we are looking for additional opportunities to participate and get the word out. But you know, the biggest thing that you can do is go to YouTube and look at the archives, our archives for Samuel Adams Returns. Simplest way to find the YouTube archives are at samueladamsreturns.net. Or if you just go and all you want to do is go to YouTube itself, it's at Samuel Adams Returns YouTube channel. All one word, Samuel Adams Returns. And you will find all of the program archives there. You'll find what I'm reading to my grandchildren on the chaplains and clergy of the Revolution, and just that type of other information and programming that Sam Adams has gone and done and spoken at different locations. So I really encourage you as you wrap up, or probably you're not going to get a lot to wrapping up 2018, but as you go into 2019, I really want to encourage you to dig into the archives, because today, well, let me finish up a little bit that we had a lot of great feedback from last week's program. Adam did a bang-up job. Adam Reddick was on. We will have him back most likely end of February, I think is what's going to fit for his schedule. So we're looking forward to having Adam back to continue talking about social emotional learning and just what a debacle it is, and what a disaster it is for the whole educational system. As we talked about last week and you've heard in other programming, is that education has been under assault severely since the 1800s, all through the 1900s, and into the 20th, in the 20th century in particular. It was all about taking and dumbing down America to the extent that we're going to talk about a number of different things. But let's get to how am I going to wrap up 2018, and then how are we going to talk a little bit about 2019. So for 2018, as we continue to observe everything that has happened during the Christmas break, everything we saw with the shutdown or the continuation of what is a partial shutdown of the government, which is virtually meaningless. It's all a ploy by especially the Democrats, but it's a useful tool in some regards to take and move an agenda forward, or to stop an agenda, either or. But the real thing that is happening, and I call it a thing because it has an inanimate aspect to it. So what that is, that thing, and we'll transcribe it now or transfer it into an element of being, is the ideology to destroy America. That's what we talk about on Liberty Works Radio Network. That's what we talk about on Samuel Adams Returns, from the perspective that the anti-federalists predicted a lot of this. But more so, I have been threatening all through 2018 to put my theological hat on. And this is very risky for me today, but it's something I have to do. And, probably with the wrap of this now end of the year, and many people may not be listening. So is it a safe place for me? In respect, it is. But on the other hand, it's laying out that whole wrap of everything that we've talked about. So one of the things I want to mention, I'm only going to have two references because everything else that I will be speaking of has already previously been referenced one way or another throughout this past year. So if you are a person that goes and looks at the reference links, especially those that are in the archives, all the links are there. They're even on the YouTube channel. If you click into that more and expand that in the YouTube channel, you will see all of the different links for all of the different references that we talk about. So I'm not pulling this stuff out of the air. I'm not pulling it out of a magic hat. What I'm doing is bringing to you a summation of truths that exist. No different than I hope that you would go out and pick up a book from Covenant to the present Constitution. That also is a summation of words that exist. So that's where I want to start. That's exactly where I want to start, is that I really do not believe that there is being spoken today a word that not has already been spoken in the past. Uh, when I read things, I sit here and I read many, many things. As I've told you before, this wall is bare over here, not because I don't have my JD degree from the University of Virginia, which we talked about in a program this past year. This wall's bare is because I haven't built all of the bookshelves yet to bring up the cases of books that I have in the basement to populate the bookcases. So we got a bare wall. But I also mentioned to you that I have a large digital library, and there is a thing called the internet too. And the large digital library has probably half a terabyte of information when I was looking at it this morning. Half a terabyte is a lot of digital books and reference material. So, that's a lot. So with that, the point is that in reading through all of that different material and all the different books that I have in physical format, you just see the same principles and words, but how are they put into place? Um, I was, for example, going through, and I think that Larry Arndt did a very nice job. If you get the imprimis, is that in the newest one, he did an article, Do We Need Our Country Anymore? And he was talking about Macaroni from France's speech and talking about internationalism and, collapsing everything into common, whatever the insanities are, the globalist stuff. And he brings everything back into context relative to not only a French gentleman by the name of Clemenceau, but also then he starts talking about Churchill, and then he finishes up with something that President Trump had said. Interesting. And then we go, and I'm not getting into detail. I think it's a good article. I think you should read it. And that's one of the references for you to look at, is because I think there's real value in reading what he had to say. But at the same time, what he left out, what Churchill left out, what Trump often leaves out, what most modern politicians, and I'll call modern from, say, I think to the extent I'll say Lincoln was one of the very few that incorporated biblical principles in his speeches. And Lincoln had a lot of problems as far as I'm concerned. He did things that is another story. But I have to go back even further. So putting on that theological hat, it is today, in my studied opinion, and I've taken a long time to study this before I've even attempted to speak to you about it, and we're never going to have enough time to cover it all, as Kathy's given me the high sign, which means I have 5 minutes left, is that we have to start with the whole premise that we need to cover the extensibility of the gospel, to which that I have always spoken. And I know that I would be surprised if ever a pastor asks me to come speak at his congregation, in that the challenges that I bring forth in the extensibility of the gospel is that which we'll talk about shortly here, in that it was that which Luther talked about, it was that which Calvin talked about, it was that which Althusius talked about, it was that which we could go to Baxter, we can go to Rutherford, we can go to Knox, we can go to any of those reformers, and they talked about the principles that formulate my summation in the context of the extensibility of the gospel. Which means very simply, and I'm going to give you this fundamental definition, and we'll pick it up once again in the next segment, and then we're going to try and do a basic, really basic walkthrough in the next segment on how that all fits. So the basic definition of the extensibility of the gospel is that God is God and we're not. Doug Wilson says that. I really like when he said that, and it's a very great submission. And with that, that means that God is, to which Luther, Calvin, and all of those others that I mentioned said, God is absolutely sovereign. Absolutely, unequivocally, totally, 100% plus sovereign. He created everything. He holds all things together. And I'm not going to go through and try and quote all sorts of scriptures for you and make this a sermon type, scripture quoting type of theological interaction, if you will. I want to bring you into those relevant pieces that were already preached. Remember, there's no words that have not already been spoken. So the only references that I can give you are the references of those that have already preached and written and talked about these things. And even, my most recent effort is that which I'm reading to my grandchildren regarding the chaplains and clergy of the Revolution, which their sermons and what they preached as Reformation-minded ministers with the extensibility of the gospel, reaching across every aspect of what we are, who we are, what we're supposed to be, what type of relationship we're supposed to have with God, what type of relationship that means we will have within ourselves and in our society. That means, what does it mean to self-govern as much as it means to take and govern within the context of our families, within the context of then the community in which we live, within the context of what we do in work, how we are those that are in leadership, whether it's in government, whether it's in work, whether it's in the church, whether it's in the family. Every aspect of that is supposed to be touched by the very essence of God with us. We're going to talk about that a little bit more, in that we just celebrated Christmas, and we hear this word and song about Emmanuel. Emmanuel, God with us. What does that mean? Is God with you? Is God with you in that fully extensible way? How does that work within your life? So those are some of the things that we're going to look at from that historical perspective, and what does it mean from, even as the anti-federalists talked about that in their arguments, and what does it mean then to be governing today? What should we be looking like in this nation if we really have believers that understand the extensibility of the gospel? Samuel Adams understood it because he was known as the last Puritan. So come on back. Those anti-federalists, they did. They got it right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they did. They got it right. And you know why they got it right? It's because of what I have spoken about many, many, many times as I closed out the last segment, is that Sam Adams, one of his monikers, was the last Puritan. He clearly understood the Reformation truths. He wasn't that whacked out, drunkard that the modern historians show him to be. No, I have to say that he was more of a John Knox, and to some extent except for the ecclesiastical component of it, the Martin Luther perspective. Because one thing on that I thought was pretty hilarious as I was doing some interesting reading in that is that Luther, he and this was written by someone that I'll talk about later, that I've already put his references out there over the past year, is that he says that Luther was courageous enough not only to break ranks with the Church of Rome, but also with the etiquette of Erasmus. He took his criticism of the Roman Church to unordained people in their own language, both linguistically and stylistically. Sam Adams did that. Sam Adams was known as the tribune of the people. And because he spoke, he understood what was happening in the streets. He understood, Donald Trump is doing a lot of that, but he's not doing it from that extensibility of the gospel perspective. That's a piece that is missing. Well, he's doing it from just that natural component of that. If you want to be a great leader, you have to go do a walkabout. You have to go out there and meet your constituents and talk to them. Meet your workers if you're a president of a company, and talk with them, interact. Don't expect and that's the problem in business. That's where we don't have the extensibility of the gospel, even in business, from a application perspective, because the guy that sits at the top necessarily doesn't know the guy that's down there pushing the broom in the bathroom. So too true. And that's even in the large churches. It doesn't mean that the most senior pastor does not know the guy that's wiping out the sink in the bathroom on Sunday, and maybe doesn't even know how to thank him, or doesn't thank him. Anyway, it gets to that kind of pieces that if you're going to communicate, and what Luther did is he reached down to the unordained people, and in their own language, as I was saying, and he broke the church's sacramental monopoly, which was really terrible at the time that the Reformation. That's why the Reformation really got going, was the selling of indulgences and all of that stuff. He changed the face of Europe. He was hated for this too. He conducted himself not as a gentleman or a scholar, but as a man of war who understood that eternal souls were hanging in the balance, not to mention Western civilization. He was hated for this, perhaps most of all. His contemporaries wanted peace. So that goes to the Imprimis article, is that Macaroni was saying that, you need to give everything up for peace and take the UN pledge as your absolute sworn thing on peace, 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 over nationalism, patriotism, and all of that. Well, that's what they wanted even at the time of Luther, was that the Holy Roman Emperor wanted peace, and his contemporaries wanted peace. But then the gospel doesn't say that we're going to have peace because we're in a war between the enemy that Jesus conquered. And that's the thing that I want to talk about as we move into the third segment as well, is Jesus conquered, and we should be living as conquerors. There's a song out there, I think, Kath, you remember, what was that? We are conquerors. What was? We are more than conquerors. Like Kath's trying to remind me. So If we're more than conquerors, even because Jesus is the conqueror, holy smokes, why are we living like idiots? I'm going to not be able to talk about all of that, but let's get back to Luther here for a minute. So this gave Luther an enormous advantage. He wanted victory, and he developed his tactics accordingly. Luther was the pioneer of pugnacious pamphlets, or in this case, we could say Luther was the author and the pioneer of pugnacious text messages or tweets. I like that. As well as the vicar of vitriol and the rector of ridicule. We have to have safe places. We have to have, what do they call this? The messaging needs to be, we have to have tolerance. We have to have all of these things. Oh, we can't talk that way. Really? We would have never had a Reformation if we didn't stuff it. If Luther didn't stuff it in the faces of those that were enslaving the people with religious with religious, what do I want to call it? With religiosity, I guess would be the simplest stuff with religion. And today, I don't care what denomination it is. You know, Roman Catholicism is only one denomination nowadays, but in today's world, what we have are other major denominations that have caved into the same rhetoric that is producing the same type of mental and social slavery that Jesus died to give us liberty. And this is what our founding fathers understood. And this is why you will hear me probably in this program a number of times saying that Jesus is the only way to liberty, that true liberty. He gives it to us when we know who he is and understand what he's done for us. But more so, what it means is that it is the extensibility of how we are victors in this world and establish self-governance that then perpetuates throughout all of society and culture and all governance. Anyway, one of the other things that was interesting in the book that I'm quoting from, I know that a lot of the other, and it's, again, I'm quoting from this book only as a point of reference because I like the way that it was these words were presented, but I've read these words in other places. So, and the other places that I read them were in the Bible itself. So this is a summation of what's already in scriptures. And the one that actually led this whole thing before Luther was Jesus himself. But prior to that, it was the prophets. Okay? And if you can't get some of this stuff out of the scripture, then you've not read scriptures. Because in pioneering pugnacious pamphlets, let's talk about Isaiah, let's talk about Ezekiel, let's talk about a number of the other prophets that were there. And if they weren't pugnacious in what they wrote, said, or did, I have no clue. Were they vitriol? Yes, they were. They were absolutely vitriol. So was Luther the vicar of it? No, I'd go back to some of the prophets. And the rector of ridicule, oh my goodness gracious. I just, my goodness gracious, even Jesus ridiculed those vipers, those den of vipers. That's ridicule, don't you think? I think so. And let's see. He adopted the rules of Augustine, and where that is, anything that is ridiculous deserves to be ridiculed. So we can look at Augustine. So let's take a look at why I am, where do I get where we're going, and where do I get this whole extensibility thing? So what I want you to think about in the next 8 minutes is about what we have, 5.5 minutes. So as we move, and then we'll talk about it some more in the third segment. Start out at Genesis, and what's really got me on this direction is that I've started reading my Bible, my newest Bible again, from Genesis, from the very beginning. So the intent was that God created everything. And in that creation, he created mankind. He created Adam and Eve. And what did he do? He walked in the garden. So God, in the whole totality of himself, has always wanted and desired that relationship with us, that he walks with us and he talks with us. He converses with us while we're doing whatever it is. And in the case of Adam and Eve, was to tend the garden, to tend all of that immediate creation in which they were established. And he established government. He established government. It wasn't about rules of, that's what government has. So here you have God is sovereign. He has taken and he has created everything. He has created humanity in that of Adam and Eve. He has relationship in interaction, walking and talking, and probably whatever those, you can only imagine the interactions you have with other people. And we're going to talk about some of the other interactions that God had in the Old Testament with the Old Testament characters as we get into the next segment. But here he is. And he establishes government. He establishes the fact that he's sovereign. And in that sovereign relationship, he says, you know what? Everything's here. Everything is absolutely yours. Everything is provided. Just, you know what? There's that tree over there. I really don't want you to participate in. I don't want you to eat the fruit of it. And if you do, there are consequences that go with it. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, that's the fundamentals of government. It establishes the boundaries upon which people live. It establishes the foundation and the principles upon which society, Adam and Eve, in relationship with God, are functioning and operating. It establishes that there are rules that have then consequences. That's the fundamentals. But everything else that's happening, God is protecting. He's providing. And not that government is supposed to provide everything. Only God can provide everything. Only God. So as we take and we think about that alone, in that God had that intent of relationship and established the fundamentals of a self-governing, because it was up to Adam and Eve outside of any outside government, was because of their relationship with God, was that it would be such, it would sustain them to the extent that then they would honor and respect everything provided for them and wouldn't have that outside need. Now we know what happened. We know that God allowed an external influence to come in, and the rest is history. The rest is history. And we're going to talk about some of that history. But the point of it is that enmity that was then established has not gone away. And now we have that devil, that enemy of God, of anyone, any human, in essence, is established to take and destroy humanity, to destroy the work of God, to take and impact it for nefarious purposes. Obviously, God has provided a means and mechanism through Christ that establishes and reestablishes relationship, and that's a lot of places where people leave it. Establish a new relationship with the Lord, and you have that. No. Jesus was even laying out the whole plan of establishing that relationship, meant that it established again his kingship, his sovereignty over everything. You hear it kind of preached, but you don't see it implemented. You don't see what it means in, again, the extensibility of the lordship of Jesus Christ over everything. And not just over our personal lives. When it is over our personal life, it means that it then reaches out across our jobs, across our family, across our political environment, across everything that we are engaged in. everything that we are touching, everything that we are interacting with. Sam Adams understood that. And again, he was called the last Puritan, and he really proved that the Anti-Federalists, they understood it as well. Come on back for the last segment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this last segment and the last program for 2018 of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists, they did. They absolutely got it right. And, Sam Adams being that last Puritan, he understood the whole aspect of the extensibility of the Reformation. As a matter of fact, he spoke of it. Well, he wrote of it, but he did speak of it in his, speech right after the Declaration of Independence, and in how he talked about returning the sovereignty, returning the sovereign to whole control of governance. And I'm paraphrasing. I'm not going to give you the exact quote. You can go look it up. It's in the archives. It's back there somewhere in this past year. I brought up Sam Adams' speech right after the Declaration of Independence. But what's important about that is what we were talking to in the last segment, is that we were walking with God in the garden, Adam and Eve were. And that relationship, that sovereignty of God, is absolutely, unequivocally, and totally restored in the work of Jesus Christ on the cross and in the resurrection. Remember, Jesus isn't still hanging on the cross there. Jesus is resurrected and ascended and sitting at his kingly place, not a princely place, his kingly place with the Father. And the whole idea of all the nations being made those footstools, guess what? That's all part of what we're supposed to be doing. And it doesn't mean just in missionary efforts, okay? So let's step back, because I said I was going to give you a couple other Old Testament examples. So as we look at the Old Testament examples, God spoke directly to different people. He spoke directly to Abram's father and said, get up and get out of here. Gather up your family and move on. When Abram's father died, he told Abraham, head to Canaan. All right, time to get moving. Along the way, there were a time when what? In the life cycle of Abram, who then became Abraham, what happened? God came and visited him, sat down, had a meal with him. There were a couple different times that Abram prepared a meal for God and the angels just before the angels went down and destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. God walked with a man. God walked with Abraham. They conversed. They negotiated. Interesting. Active prayer. Wow. That was interesting when you think about that. Then, when Abraham got his name changed, God sat down with Abraham and did a covenantal meal where the animals were split in half. And it was a covenantal meal. Very important. But it was God meeting with Abraham. Interesting. There were other times that God met in some physical form, recognizable physical form, with people in the Old Testament. Go read about it. But then, what we just celebrated is that we have Emmanuel. What we have is that God with us, because now God did that which we cannot comprehend even why, except that he's had all of these other desires and intent in relationship with people, individuals, and people in general. Just think about Moses up on the mountain with the cloud and the storm and God's presence and all of that, and then being with the people of Israel in the presence of the cloud or the fire. We have the total and absolute presence of God, Christ, Jesus, in totality, in human flesh, for a intended purpose that God designed. And that was to set us free. Set us free initially from our sins, but to set humanity free in the basis of God's absolute total sovereignty and understanding what that meant. In the past segment, I mentioned about Luther being pugnacious and vitriol and ridiculing. Jesus did a lot of that with the political leaders of the day. So many pastors and church leaders and that only focus, they get this little, and you guys on YouTube are seeing me taking and holding the blinders up. All they ever see is the Pharisees and Sadducees as the religious leaders of the day. Well, even with that, Jesus was all of that to them. But those religious leaders of the day were also the Sanhedrin. They were members of the political class that were leading the people to their destruction. Okay? And all through the Old Testament, what we see is that the religious leaders are the political leaders, to the extent that you either have good political leaders that have that relationship with the living God, that understand that, like David, or miss it, like Saul. And then you see what happens within the context of a nation, and Israel being that. But you can take it outside of that. You can look at what happened with Nebuchadnezzar. Look what happened with a number of the others that weren't of the Jewish nation. But when did they acknowledge God? What happened? When did they not acknowledge God? What happened? It's all part of how he interacts within the context of his creation. And this is what the Reformation brought fully to bear. It's not about religion. It's not about some denomination. It's not about that political, social environment, because let's face it, what happened and what was really being taken on by Luther as well was not just the Roman Catholic Church and what was happening around indulgences and all these guys getting rich. It was also that whole political class, because bishops and priests and all of that had political power over the people. And then there were those that were the kings and so on and so forth, and the Holy Roman Empire and emperor that Luther stood up against. You saw the same thing that happened with Knox, Calvin. All of this was, wait a minute, what happened in that political realm when someone acknowledged God? And let's take a step back into the Old Testament again. God was always the sovereign king over the people of Israel, until again, in their arrogance and want and desire, they decided that they wanted a king like everybody else. And he was really upset about that. So go read Samuel and go figure out what he had to say about that. When Samuel said, "You really want me to go give them a king?" And he goes, "Oh yeah." And then what did Samuel say as the words of God about that? You know what? You're going to bow down to this guy. He's going to take your sons and daughters. He's going to take your property. He's going to do this. He's going to do that. He's going to do this. He's going to do that. And you're going to be fundamentally enslaved to the people. So the Reformation also brought about that whole aspect, as I mentioned earlier in the Western civilization perspective, is that we now begin to understand what's going on for a free people. Free people in the extensibility of the living God. Were there bumps along the way? Absolutely. But I think we're at a place now where we have to understand that in our country, it was Reformation minded people, the Puritans, which I have a whole thing on Rutherford that I was going to talk about as well. I printed out on Lex Rex and some of the things that he said and some of the things that he argued. And my, oh my, I just don't have time to get into it. But, you know, the Puritans magisterially determined that the kings are not of God's creation by authoritative commission, but only by permission extorted by impromptuity and way given that they may be a scourge to sinful people. Sinful people. The kings were not to be a scourge to godly people. The same thing in America. The intent was, and you hear me argue this all the time, is that the Federalists expected that the pastors, which were there at the Revolution, those chaplains and those pastors, would be able to continue to do their job and keeping the people into that whole idea of a moral and virtuous people, that they would understand you as individuals would have that context of that morality and that virtue that was biblically sound from that Reformation perspective. And what did it mean for our self-governance so that then we can be a part of society and govern in the manner that then constitutes a society within the context and framework of a republic. And that we would have that same type of representation that Moses then brought about based on his father-in-law's recommendation that was God-inspired, that you would have fundamentally a republic. It's not about what came out of Rome and Greece. It's not about those ancients. It's about what did God lay out. And here's the nut, all right, Kathy's just shown me 3 minutes. The nut is that we have given up. Christians have given up. The church has given up. And for its idea of peace, which Macaroni is talking about on the UN, the peace to bow down and tolerance and all of that, we've given up the liberty that Jesus has given us in totality and the extensibility of the gospel. Because you know what? You cannot be a Christian leader if you're in a major corporation because you've got to give in to all of this other tolerance. How did that happen? We lost sight of the truth and the extensibility of what God did and that He is absolutely sovereign. And we live our eternity now. My friends, as we get down to the last 2 minutes here, I just don't have time to keep on, and I don't know. We'll see what happens for 2019. We got a lot more to cover in those anti-federalists relative to what's happening today. And looking at those mirrors of history and defining that and to try and bringing it back, because we have all of the socialists and everything. But one of the things that I want to leave you with in the last minute and a half is that you don't live your eternity tomorrow. Eternity is when your eyes do shut, you quit breathing, and you leave this body. But if you are a believer in Jesus Christ and understand His sovereignty and the absolute sovereignty of God, your eternity is now. It's now. You're living it now. And it's not about just when I go to heaven. No. The extensibility of the gospel means that you are in eternity within the context of your secondary citizenship of being here on this earth. And you're responsible to the King and acting out His will as He prayed in the Our Father is His will in heaven and on earth. You know what? The church of God does not carry out the will of Jesus Christ on earth, the King of Kings, and what it means to be sovereign. So I think that's interesting. I don't know if we'll get into any more of Tom's simplistic theological ideas as we get into 2019. I don't know. Maybe somebody will ask me to expound on it. But the reality is we live our eternity now. God is sovereign. The gospel is supposed to be across everything, and we're not supposed to become tolerant. We're not supposed to give in to the enemy of any nature, any way. We've won because Jesus has won. Samuel Adams understood that as the last Puritan, and the Anti-Federalists, yes, they did. They absolutely got it right, and we'll see you in 2019.